I have been called many things in my life: the feared Duke of Stormfield, a man of iron temper, a wall that the whole of society could not scale. My tenants respected me. My peers were wary of me. My own valet admitted once in an unguarded moment that he had taken the position only because the pay was exceptional and he had hoped to retire before I spoke to him twice in the same week. I did not argue the point. But there is one thing no one called me, and it is the only word that mattered: hers. I was not hers for 10 years. I made very certain of it. I first saw Cecily Wrenmore in the autumn of 1845, at Alderton Hall, the country seat of her brother Edmund, who had been my closest friend since we were 8 years old, and he had pushed me into the river for calling his horse ugly. The horse was ugly. Edmund pushed me anyway. That was the nature of our friendship, honest, bruising, and absolute. When he dragged me out of the water, he said, quite cheerfully, "Now we're even for what you said about my Latin," and from that moment we understood each other. I arrived at Alderton Hall on a Thursday evening in October, road-weary and in no mood for company. Edmund had promised me 3 days of shooting, a decent claret, and no eligible daughters paraded through the drawing-room by hopeful mothers. He had delivered on 2 of the 3. The third fell apart within 20 minutes of my arrival, when a girl of 13 appeared in the doorway of the library, clutching a copy of Herodotus to her chest with both arms, staring at me with dark, serious eyes, as though I had materialized in the wrong chapter of history. "You're Edmund's duke," she said. "I am Edmund's friend," I corrected, "a duke only by circumstance." She considered this with a gravity that I found, absurdly, rather bracing. Most people fell over themselves correcting their familiarity. She simply held her ground. "Edmund says you know Greek," she said. "Better than he does," which he said with his jaw tight, so I believe it. "Edmund's Greek is adequate," I said. "His Latin is worse." "He knows this." "He does," she agreed, and a small, private smile crossed her face, as though we had confirmed some shared knowledge of the world's workings. Then she turned and walked away, back toward whatever corner of the house she had come from, the Herodotus still pressed to her chest, and I stood in the doorway of the library and watched her go and thought nothing of it at all. That is what I told myself. For 10 years, I told myself I had thought nothing of it. I watched her grow up at a distance, in the way that a man watches the seasons change over a landscape he passes through yearly but does not own. Every visit to Alderton Hall brought her slightly altered, taller, quieter in company, more precise in her opinions. She was not the beauty of the family. That distinction belonged to her elder sister, Harriet, who had a high color and a quick laugh, and was married very well within her first season. Cecily was plain, people said, and too serious for her own good, and bookish in a manner that made her difficult to match. She spoke when she had something to say and remained silent when she did not, which was, apparently, an intolerable quality in a young woman seeking a husband. I could not see it. Every time she opened her mouth, I found I had been waiting for whatever she would say next. I kept that observation locked inside me with the same discipline I applied to everything else in my life. Cecily Wrenmore was Edmund's sister. Edmund, who had pulled me out of the river when we were 8 and had never once stopped being the truest friend I possessed. A man did not look at his best friend's sister and allow the looking to become something else. It was a line of honor as plain as any written code, and I was not a man who crossed his own lines. So I did not cross it. I spoke to her at family dinners with perfect propriety. I engaged her in discussion of whatever she was reading, which was always something worth discussing. I disagreed with her opinions when I disagreed, which she seemed to prefer to easy agreement, and she argued back without deference, which I preferred to easy surrender. I carried on doing this for 10 years, and I told myself it was friendship, the comfortable, impersonal variety that an older man extends to a friend's younger sister out of courtesy, and nothing else. In my better moments, alone at Stormfield in the winter quiet, I was honest enough to call it what it was. I was in love with Cecily Wrenmore. I had been since she stood in that library doorway at the age of 13, and told me I was Edmund's duke with the calm confidence of someone who had decided where things stood and saw no reason to revise the arrangement. And I would go to my grave without acting on it, because she was Edmund's, and Edmund was everything, and a man who could not hold his own line deserved neither. I received the letter on a Wednesday in September of 1855. Edmund wrote it himself, in his loose, efficient hand, the kind of letter he wrote when he was telling me good news and was slightly embarrassed about how pleased he was. Cecily had accepted Lord Fenwick. The match had been settled over the summer. Fenwick was a respectable widower of 50, a man of moderate estate and quiet temperament, and their father was satisfied. Edmund said Cecily seemed content. He said she had told him, quite calmly, that she was 23 and it was time to settle the question sensibly, and Fenwick was a sensible answer. Edmund added, with what I suspected was careful neutrality, that he thought she deserved a great deal better than sensible, but that he had said so to their father and been overruled, and that was the way of things. I read the letter 3 times. Then I put it in the fire, which was something I had not done with a piece of correspondence since I was 19 and someone had attempted to blackmail me. And I sat in my study at Stormfield and stared at the flames until there was nothing left of it. It was none of my doing. She had accepted. She was content. I had held my line for 10 years and the result was exactly what I had intended. She was free of any complication from me, untouched by whatever I had felt, moving sensibly through her life in the direction of a sensible match. I sat with that understanding until the fire died to coals. Then I wrote to Edmund and accepted the invitation to his autumn house party, which he had included almost as an afterthought at the end of the letter, and which I had been intending to decline. I told myself I was going because I always went, because Edmund expected it, because 3 days of shooting and a decent claret were as much as a man in my position asked of the autumn. I told myself any number of things on the road from Stormfield to Alderton Hall, with the carriage wheels turning under me and the countryside moving past the window in its slow October colors. I was still telling myself these things when the carriage turned up the Alderton Drive, and I made myself stop. The house was full in the way it only was when Edmund hosted, easy and warm, with fires in every grate and neighbors in from 3 miles in every direction, and the sound of a piano drifting from somewhere on the ground floor. I arrived in the late afternoon, and Edmund met me in the hall with a handshake and no ceremony, which was the only way I ever wanted to be met. His wife, Clara, greeted me warmly and told me my room was the same one I always used. Harriet's husband was there. 2 of Edmund's shooting friends, a vicar from the next parish who had the useful quality of never attempting to improve me, and Cecily in the drawing room, standing near the window with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, watching the last of the light fade across the park. She turned when I entered, and there was a half-second where something moved across her face, not quite surprise, because she would have known I was expected, but something quieter than that. A kind of settling. She said, "Good evening, Aldrich." In the easy way she had always addressed me, Edmund's household had never stood on ceremony with titles, and I had told her years ago she need not call me Your Grace, and I said good evening, and we both looked at the window and the park, and the moment passed. I was a fool to have come. I was more of a fool than I had known, because 10 years of careful distance had done nothing at all. I sat at dinner that night and watched her debate the vicar on the question of whether Tacitus was a reliable narrator of his own era. She thought not. The vicar thought yes with reservations, and I contributed nothing because I was too busy listening to the way she made her argument. Measured, specific, a little devastating in her precision, delivered without heat and without mercy. The vicar enjoyed it enormously. He told her she had a finer mind than half the men he'd studied with at Oxford, which she received without false modesty and without vanity, just a brief nod that said she knew it and was pleased he'd noticed. I looked at my plate and thought about Fenwick. Fenwick was 50, he had a moderate estate. He was a sensible answer to the question of Cecily Renmore's future, and she had said so herself, and I had no right to any opinion on the matter whatsoever. I held that thought with both hands all through dinner and into the drawing room after, where Clara played the piano and Edmund poured a better burgundy than was strictly warranted by a Tuesday evening in October, and Cecily sat near the window and listened to the music with her hands folded in her lap, and her face turned slightly away from the lamp, so that she was all quiet profile and shadow, and I stood near the fireplace with my glass and did not look at her. I looked at her continuously. I noted, with the precision of a man who has catalogued something against his will for a decade, that she was wearing a gray evening gown with a narrow ribbon at the collar, that she had dressed her hair differently than she usually did at Alderton, looser, a few dark strands at her temple, and that she smiled once, softly, at some turn in the music, entirely to herself, not for the room. I had seen her smile that way before, always when she thought no one was watching, and it was the smile that had undone me longest, the private one, the one that was genuinely hers and not performed for any audience. Edmund appeared at my elbow at some point and said very quietly, "You're staring." "I'm observing," I said. "Aldrich," he said it the way he had said my name since we were boys, when he wanted me to stop arguing and hear something. "You came." "I told you I would." "You declined the last 2 invitations," he said, "and you did not decline this one, which arrived 3 days after my letter about the Fenwick match." He paused. "I'm not drawing a conclusion, I am merely noting the sequence of events." "Your sequencing is impeccable," I said, and drank my burgundy, and did not look at my closest friend. And he moved away and left me to the fireplace and the unforgiving accuracy of his observation. Clara finished her piece to warm applause, and Edmund persuaded Harriet's husband to attempt a folk song from his native county, which went badly in the most enjoyable possible way. And the room laughed, and Cecily turned from the window and laughed too, the open kind, unguarded, and for a moment her eyes met mine across the room. She looked away first. I did not flatter myself. She simply looked away, as one does when one catches an acquaintance staring and neither party wishes to make more of it than it is. I told myself this was nothing. I had been telling myself things were nothing for 10 years, and I was very good at it, and it had helped me exactly not at all. The second day brought shooting in the morning and rain in the afternoon, and the afternoon drove everyone indoors, and the house rearranged itself into its comfortable rainy day pattern, cards in the drawing room, a fire in the library, conversations that wandered the way they only do when no one has anywhere to be. I found myself in the library because I always ended up in the library, and Cecily was there before me, exactly where she had stood 30 years ago in my memory. No, 10 years ago, no, 20 in effect, because she had always been in that library, curled in the chair nearest the window with a book open on her lap, and she did not look up when I entered, which was the most natural thing in the world. I took the chair on the other side of the fireplace and read for 20 minutes in silence. "You've been very quiet," she said, without looking up from her book. "I am often quiet." "You're differently quiet." She turned a page. "At dinner last night you didn't argue with Reverend Marsh about Tacitus, and you always argue about Tacitus. You wrote a paper about Tacitus once. Edmund still mentions it when he wants to embarrass you." I was not aware I was under observation. She looked up then, and her expression was composed and a little amused and entirely direct. Cecily had never learned, or had never bothered, to look at people from behind a social veil. She simply looked at them with those dark, serious eyes that saw everything they were aimed at. "You're always under observation when you're in a room," she said. "You take up a great deal of it, not in an unpleasant way, you simply do." I had no answer for that. I looked at the fire. "Is something troubling you?" she asked, in the same easy tone she would use to ask whether I wanted more tea. "No." "All right," she said, and returned to her book, and that was that. She did not press. She never pressed. It was one of the qualities I had come to think of, privately and with some pain, as among her finest. I sat in that chair for another half-hour and thought about what I was doing. I had come here telling myself it was habit, friendship, the natural course of things. But that was not why I had come, and I knew it, and the rain against the library window was relentless, and Cecily turned pages beside the fire, and I had perhaps 8 months before she became Lady Fenwick, and I had not spoken a word of truth in 10 years. The third day was clear, with the particular bright coldness of October when autumn decides to perform itself for an audience. Edmund organized a walk across the home farm in the morning. By early afternoon, the party had dispersed into its various corners, and I found myself walking alone in the formal garden at the east side of the house, which was past its summer arrangement, but still held a kind of severe beauty in its bare hedges and stone paths. Cecily found me there, or I found her, or we arrived at the same stone bench by the same instinct at the same moment, and stood for a second looking at each other across the path. "I came to read," she said, holding up a small volume. "The garden is quiet in the afternoon." "I came to walk," I said, "for the same reason." We looked at each other for a moment, and then she sat on the bench, and I stood near the hedge, and neither of us went away. "You'll be back in London for the winter?" she asked. "Yes, Parliament opens in November." "And back to Stormfield before Christmas?" "If the session permits." She nodded, her eyes on the bare path. There was a quality to her quietness that afternoon that I could not name, something slightly stilled, a person holding themselves very carefully, the way one does when one is managing something. "I'm glad you came this week," she said after a moment. "Edmund is always better when you're here. He laughs more." "He laughs too much when I'm not here," I said. "I provide a corrective influence." She did smile at that briefly and genuinely, and then she looked back at the path. "I shall be in London in the spring," she said. "Lord Fenwick has a house in Mayfair," a pause, very small. "I shall be settled by then, quite settled." The word was ordinary. She said it ordinarily. I heard in it every year of restraint I had spent, all the careful distance, all the silence that I had told myself was honor, and that I now wondered, with something cold moving through me, had only been cowardice dressed in better clothes. "Cecily," I said. She looked up. I had no idea what I had meant to say. I stood in an October garden beside a woman I had been in love with for 10 years, and I opened my mouth, and nothing that came out would have been honorable, so I closed it again. "Yes," she said. "I hope you will be happy," I said. "Fenwick is." "A sensible answer," she said, with a lightness that did not quite reach her eyes. "Yes. I've said so." "You have. And you think I should be content with a sensible answer." "I think you should be content with a great deal more than a sensible answer," I said, more sharply than I had intended. She looked at me for a long moment. "That is remarkably easy to say." I held her gaze. I wanted to look away. I did not. "I know it is." We sat with that for a moment, the October light thin and honest around us, and then she stood, brushing a few dry leaves from her coat, and said she ought to go back inside, and went, and I stood in the garden until the cold had worked its way through my coat, which took quite some time. I was not a man given to impulse. I had never acted without consideration. I had spent 10 years in deliberate, disciplined restraint, and I had believed this was virtue. What I understood, standing in that garden with the cold working through my coat, was that there is a kind of cowardice that has excellent manners and a code of honor and a great many reasons, and that I had been living inside it for a decade, and Cecily was going to marry Fenwick because I had held my line so faithfully that she had never had any reason to know the line existed. I had told myself the line protected her. I saw now that it had only protected me from the risk of asking, from the prospect of refusal, from the exposure that comes when a man admits plainly that he wants what he has been pretending not to want. The honor was real in the beginning. The discipline was real. But at some point along the 10 years, it had curdled into something else, a shelter for my own pride, dressed in the language of respect. Edmund was in the estate office. He was in the estate office at the back of the house, going over accounts with his steward, and when he saw my face, he dismissed the steward with a word and closed the door and said, "Sit down, Aldrich." "I would rather stand." "Then stand," he said, "and tell me what you've done." "Nothing yet," I said. "That is the difficulty. I want your permission to do something, Edmund, and I want to say it plainly. If you refuse, I will not do it, and I will accept that, and it will not touch what we have between us. Not one bit of it." Edmund sat back. He watched me with his level brown eyes, which had never in 30 years looked at me with anything less than the truth. "Go on, then," he said. "I am in love with your sister," I said. "I have been since she was 13 years old and corrected me in the library, or since some moment shortly thereafter. I have not acted on it. I did not intend to act on it because she is yours and you are mine, and a man does not complicate that without asking. I am asking." The silence was very long. Then Edmund said, "Aldrich, you absolute idiot." "I take the point." 10 years, he said. "Yes. You have been in love with Cecily for 10 years. He rubbed a hand over his face. "I have watched you have dinner with her 40 times. I have watched you argue Tacitus with her and argue Thucydides with her, and once sit in this very room and listen to her read aloud for an hour while you pretended to work. I thought—" He stopped. He shook his head. "I thought she might have a chance of it if you ever stopped being such a profoundly disciplined fool." I stood very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Edmund said, in the careful tone of a man choosing words with great precision, "that my sister is not indifferent to you. She has not been for some time. I am her brother, and she has not said so, because Cecily does not say things she is not certain of, and she was never certain, because you have spent 10 years being utterly opaque." He stood from the desk and crossed to the window and looked out at the park, and for a moment he did not speak, and I thought perhaps I had miscalculated, that the friendship could not hold this, that I had presumed too much, that the river would claim me a second time. Then he turned, and his face was the face of my oldest friend, tired and fond and thoroughly exasperated. "Yes," he said. "You have my permission, my blessing, my emphatic endorsement. Our father's approval is another matter, but I believe once Stormfield is mentioned, he will not object strenuously. Please go and speak to her before she leaves tomorrow morning, and ruins both your lives in the name of being sensible." I was already at the door. Aldrich Edmund said. I stopped. "If you make her unhappy, I will push you into a river again, a deeper one." "I know," I said. "I would deserve it." I found Cecily in the upper hall, coming from her room with a traveling case, beginning the quiet mechanics of departure. A gown folded, items arranged, the small preparatory actions of someone who has accepted where she is going. She stopped when she saw me. I was standing in the hallway between her door and the staircase, which was perhaps more aggressive than I had intended, but I did not move. "Aldrich," she said, "I was going to come down for dinner in half an hour." "I need to speak to you now," I said, "before I lose my nerve." She looked at me with those steady dark eyes, and something shifted in them, not alarm, but attention, the kind she gave to things she wanted to understand. "You never lose your nerve." "I have managed to preserve it for 10 years, I said. "By saying nothing, I can't do it anymore." She set the traveling case down very slowly. "I am in love with you," I said. "I have been since you told me I was Edmund's Duke and looked at me as though that settled the question of where I belonged. I have spent 10 years calling it courtesy and propriety and friendship, and all of those words were true, but they were not the whole truth, and the whole truth is that every time I leave Alderton Hall, I count the months until I can come back. Every time you speak, I am listening before you have finished your first word. I held my line because you are Edmund's and Edmund is everything to me. But I asked him, just now, and he gave me his blessing. And I am standing here because the alternative is watching you leave tomorrow to marry a man who will give you a sensible life. And I would rather have said this and been refused than said nothing, and carried that silence until I was dead." The hallway was very quiet. Cecily looked at me for a long time without speaking. Her expression was utterly unreadable, which was not usual for her. She was generally precise, and her face tended to follow her thoughts. I stood there and did not look away, and the 10 years stood between us like a piece of furniture neither of us had named. "Aldrich," she said at last, very quietly, "how long ago did you say?" "Autumn of 1845, approximately." "That is 10 years. "Yes." She pressed her lips together, and for a moment I thought she might be angry. She had a right to be, I thought, for the years of silence, for the careful distance that had given her no ground to stand on, and then I saw it was not anger. Her eyes were bright, and not from anger. "I have been in love with you since I was 16, she said, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for truths she had long since accepted. "Since you told me that my translation of the Iliad was better than Edmund's, and then added without any trace of condescension that it was also better than most of what you had read from scholars twice my age. I thought I assumed—" She stopped. A breath. "You were so entirely correct at all times, so proper. I thought you were fond of me the way one is fond of a small and tolerable fixture of one's friend's household. I told myself that was enough. I made peace with it, a number of times." She looked at me directly. "Lord Fenwick is a sensible answer to the question of my life, Aldrich, because I had no reason to expect any other answer." "You gave me no reason." "I know," I said. "I am asking now if you will give me the chance to give you one." She looked at me, and the bright in her eyes resolved into something clear and decided, the expression she wore when she had considered a question thoroughly and arrived at the only honest answer. "You know," she said, "that I am going to have a great many things to say to you about 10 years of unnecessary silence." "I know. And you are prepared to hear them." "Every word," I said. "I have been waiting 10 years to hear whatever you wish to say to me." The small smile that crossed her face then was different from any I had seen before. Not the brief, private amusement of the library, not the quick warmth of a good argument, but something deeper and steadier, the kind of smile that comes from a person who has just been handed exactly what they had stopped hoping for and is trying to decide whether to trust it. "Then I will not marry Lord Fenwick," she said. "And I will have a great many things to say to you, and you will listen." "I will listen to everything you have ever wanted to say," I told her, "and everything you have not thought to say yet for as long as you are willing to speak." She picked up the traveling case and set it on the hall table, not for packing, but for unpacking. "Then I suppose I had better stay a day or two longer," she said. I came to stand beside her, close enough for the first time in 10 years that I could have reached out my hand and touched hers. I did reach out. She did not pull away. Her fingers were small and cold from the unheated hall, and I folded them in mine, and we stood in the upper hallway of Alderton Hall while the last of the October light came through the window at the end of the passage, and it was the quietest and the most complete moment of my entire life. Edmund found us there some time later, and said nothing at all beyond pressing his mouth flat against whatever expression was trying to get out, and going back down the stairs at speed. We were married in December at Stormfield, in the chapel that had stood on the estate since the time of the Tudors. Edmund stood with me. Clara and Harriet stood with Cecily. The vicar from the Alderton parish performed the ceremony, which meant that when he pronounced us married he added, quite outside the prescribed text, that he had known this was coming since the dinner table argument about Tacitus, and that it was about time. Cecily laughed. It startled the assembled guests. It did not startle me. I had been waiting 10 years for the sound of it, close enough that it was meant for me. She told me later, on the long evening after the wedding when the house had gone quiet around us, and we sat together in the Stormfield library, her library now, and she had already identified the section that wanted reorganizing, that she had made her peace with me a dozen times and unmade it a dozen times, and that she had accepted Fenwick precisely because she could not unmake it a 13th. "I was resigned," she said, with the particular precision she always brought to self-examination. "Not content. I want you to understand the difference." "I understand it," I said. "I was resigned myself for 10 years. There is a great deal of difference." "There is," she agreed. She looked at the shelves. "Your Tacitus is shelved between Suetonius and a volume of agricultural reports from 1842. That is not a defensible arrangement." "I will defend it vigorously," I said. "You will lose," she said, pulling the Tacitus from the shelf, "because I am right." She was right. She was right about the Tacitus, and about the agricultural reports, and about approximately 3/4 of the other opinions she held. And I spent the rest of my life telling her so when she was right, and arguing with her when she was wrong, and being argued with in return, and finding that the particular sound of Cecily Wrenmore, Cecily Ravensworth, Duchess of Stormfield, holding her ground on the other side of a library fire, was the sound I had been listening for since I was 22 years old, in a hallway with river water still in my boots, and a girl of 13 in the doorway holding Herodotus to her chest. I had been Edmund's Duke then. I became hers. There are worse endings to 10 years of silence. There are far worse things to become.